Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fahy. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision, the standards, and the culture of healthcare systems. If you want to join in the conversation or learn more about activating physician leadership, go to license2leadpodcast.com, where you can send me an email or even leave me a voice message. I'd love to hear from you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. This is Patty Fahy. In this episode, I interviewed Dr. Scott Smith, a healthcare leader who is an internal medicine physician. This will be the first of many interviews where I profile outstanding leaders, mostly in healthcare. I want to put a spotlight on the traits of effective leaders, and especially on the actions leaders take which make them effective. In the big overview, at least to my mind, terrific leaders create healthy cultures, and those healthy cultures give rise to the great business outcomes that Gallup and other researchers have shown are associated with strong, positive cultures. Great business outcomes like increased profit, decreased employee turnover, better customer service, and in our industry, better patient satisfaction and outcomes. But how do leaders do that? How do they go about creating a strong organizational culture and better business outcomes? What's their actual work and what is their actual behavior? To talk about the work that leaders do or ought to be doing, I use a three-part model based on Mary Beth O'Neill's work. And the headlines are, number one, leaders communicate the territory. And by that, she means that they understand their industry and the organization, and they articulate the purpose and goals and challenges to stakeholders. Number two, leaders create outstanding teams and facilitate the work of those teams. This includes, among other work, knocking down barriers, improving team communication, and recognizing high performers, whatever it might take to get outstanding team performance. And then number three, leaders produce results, primarily through others, and they hold their teams accountable. I'll come back to these three areas describing the work of leaders during this episode and in future podcasts. My hope is that physicians at all phases of their careers will be inspired by the people I interview and learn something from them as well. My guest today, Dr. Scott Smith, is a friend and someone whose career and accomplishments I've been a witness to for many years. When I think of consistently accomplished leaders, I think of Scott Smith. In fact, if you look up great physician leader in the dictionary, you'll see a picture of, well, nobody, because that's not really how dictionaries work. But I will say Dr. Smith is unsurpassed with his breadth of knowledge, his drive for results, and his ability to engage his teams to get the hard work done. It wasn't that long after joining Kaiser Permanente that he gained some national recognition for leading a successful electronic medical record implementation. And that certainly was not the norm at the time for them to be successful, that is. And a few years later, he was promoted to the executive team. Currently, he's an SVP with CHRISTUS Trinity Clinic in Texas and a leader at the system level with CHRISTUS Health, where he has responsibilities in 4 states and in Latin America. In this podcast, you'll hear Scott Smith answer questions. You'll hear me provide some additional narrative as we go along, and there'll be a few other people who chime in on this podcast as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Hello, Dr. Smith. Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Patty. That certainly is a very kind introduction. I'm flattered, and as usual, you are too kind.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, and I especially appreciate you being part of my steep podcast learning curve. You're my first leader interview. So I remember, of course, that we met at Kaiser Permanente. I don't remember what you were doing prior to that.
I was with the Air Force, and I was the chief of cardiopulmonary medicine in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and with Kirtland Air Force Base. And that was my role, and loved it.
Well, that level of enthusiasm is quintessential Scott Smith, I would say. You have so many roles, and you're able to juggle more balls than anyone I know, figuratively anyway. My husband, as you know, is a juggler, and he juggles more balls literally than anyone else I know. But you maintain such a positive attitude in the face of an enormous workload. How do you do that?
I really do enjoy what I do so much, and not to make fun of that cliche, but you really find what you enjoy doing. You won't work a day in your life. And that really pertains to me, my job as a physician, the extraordinary privilege I have to lead physicians and improve processes. I love it. It is not work to me at all.
Yeah, that's so cool. Well, Scott, can you tell us a little bit about your current role?
I'm the Vice President of Operations for CHRISTUS Health and oversee all of our ambulatory practices in the United States. And I also serve in a supportive role for our operations in Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, and Chile. As you mentioned at the top of the podcast, we have practices in about 4 states, and we have over 1,000 physicians and advanced practice clinicians. And together, my operational partners that I work with, we help support the strategy, profit and loss, obviously the budget of each of the locations, the hiring of the physicians and clinicians, the quality reports, the service aspect, the productivity, facilities. And all of my work is really focused in the ambulatory environment and help grow our system and provide the best care we can.
And do you find a way to still see patients in the middle of all that?
I do. I see patients every other Monday. And so I do that because it's fun and I enjoy connecting with the patients. But also it's good for me to keep up to date with using the electronic medical record, experiencing what, the patients share about the parking experience, front desk, how the computer's working, me writing referrals to my colleagues I work with, and, they hear me call for a consult. I think it's good for them to see me in the clinic role. But it's also good for me to experience the delivery system that the doctors I work with, that they experience.
Yes. I mean, there has to be something that really makes it worthwhile because it takes so much bandwidth as a full-time leader to keep your skills up so you can continue to see patients.
And primary care is very hard. There are fewer residents selecting or medical students selecting it because of the disparity that still exists between pay and primary care and some of the high volume procedural specialties. And but something we get to have that's not really rewarded with money, it's the long-term relationship to be with a family of patients for 10, 20 plus years. And so one example, Patty, as you know, my wife and I had 4 children, then we adopted 7 from China. Maybe that could be another podcast for another time. And so we have 11 children. One of my patients gave me an early gift, and she had hand sewn 13 Christmas stockings. And she told me she started in July and worked on those for 6 months. And I just thanked her so much. And she said, "Oh, Dr. Smith, you have no idea, what you've done for my husband and I. We'll always be grateful to you for that." That's just one, example of doctors like myself in primary care and other specialties get to have that impact in the patient's life. And, what a reward that we get to do that. Yeah. And then we get paid for it. Yeah. So I think it's a high calling and noble career, and it's just fantastic.
I used to think it was fantastic if a patient brought me a fresh tomato. I can only imagine 13 handmade Christmas stockings. So, Scott, had you had any prior experience in doing international work before taking on this role in Latin America?
I had the opportunity to also do some consulting and learning in Canada with the Canadian health system, England with the national health system, again, in Ireland. And so I had studied and been a part of 3 different national health systems before traveling to Colombia and Chile.
Did the patients seem to have different needs than what you've seen in the States?
Patients in the ambulatory setting need care, they need advice, they need their medicines, they need access and how to get into their doctor, how to have the procedures, get the test results back to the doctor, get that communication back to the patient. And then we have the interface with the hospital, the emergency rooms. And all of those countries are overrun because of the absence of primary care or access to primary care. And then in the hospital side, it's, length of stay. And those are the exact same issues that I had when I worked with you in Kaiser Permanente in Colorado and my system here in Texas. There are just so many similarities. The difference is the money. what insurance pays for, how the physicians are paid, and what the incentives are for a patient to go to an emergency room versus primary care, or incentives for the physician. What's the money pathway, and what are the financial incentives from everybody's perspective?
So what surprised you, or what did you have to tackle first?
Would you believe there's less continuity of care in other countries than what we have here in the United States? And there are many who have published on this with the patient-centered medical home. Paul Grundy and others. I had the opportunity to work with them and some of their initiatives and data to see that quality outcomes are better and costs are lower. That really in the health system I worked with in Colombia, you call and got in. There was no continuity relationship. And so my organization was financially responsible for total medical cost of all of these patients, several $100,000. And there was no continuity or network. And so both with my work here with CHRISTUS in Texas, and also work with Kaiser Permanente, which is how that model is, I was able to say, hey, wait a minute, we need to define a narrow network and find out these patients who have the most chronic conditions and get them linked to a primary doctor where they see this one doctor all the time. And that was a brand new concept.
Wow.
That had never been done before. And so they liked it. It made sense. It worked in the U.S. It should work in Colombia. Fortunately, they did have good informatics and very smart clinicians. So we were able to run the database and find patients who had 4 or more chronic conditions. And so we started with them. I remember the really old American Express commercial, don't leave home without it. You're invited to the club. Are you in? And so I said, hey, let's let them know we are inviting you to a concierge level medicine. We've invited you to have your own personal physician. And here's your card. Here's the physician's name. Here's the telephone number. Contact this physician for all of your healthcare needs. We couldn't require it, so it was an opt-in. And, we started with 8 or 10 primary care physicians that I was able to meet with personally and help train them on the concept. And then over the years, we grew to over 100,000 patients that were linked to primary care physicians.
Well, I imagine you had a boatload of metrics. What did your results end up looking like?
Of course, the quality measures were outstanding, 2 times better than national average. Cost dropped by like $700,000 US per month. It was just a fantastic thing to be a part of. And then the health system did a video of both patients and physicians. And I remember, quite frankly, I teared up watching those videos when they showed it to me when I was in Colombia. It was a physician who was probably in his low 60s. And he said, the impact on this on my career has been better than I ever imagined. I wish I would have had this model to practice in my whole life. And then it showed another patient, and she said, I'm alone. My children have moved away. If I did not have my Dr. Blank who calls in and checks on me, and his nurse checks to make sure I'm doing okay and taking my medicine, I would have no one to care for me. She said, I just thank God for whoever came up with this model of care.
Oh, Scott.
And I'm like, oh my God.
I think listeners are starting to get a picture of you as a leader. But to go there more explicitly, can you talk about a project that you've taken on that's been important to you, or something that you're really proud of?
I would probably say the work we've been able to do with improving patient access to care, both in Colorado and with CHRISTUS Health. Talking about physician as leader, I'm going to, shout out Dr. Kara Beatty, who's the physician who worked with us in Kaiser, Colorado. And she introduced the team and I was the vice president of primary care at the time to the advanced access principle. And we were trying to get patient access down within 14 days. And she said, no, you can do it in 3 days. And we're like, 3 days? We're trying to hit 14 from 30 and 45.
Dr. Smith described some details of matching the supply of appointments to the demand for appointments. He sang the praises of Dr. Kara Beatty and her influence and her expertise. And then he also made it clear that improving access meant changing the templates for physician schedules. So I asked him, how was that received?
No doctor ever has said, hey, Scott, would you make my template for me today? And no one ever will. And we give them the tools and we teach them the concept. And that reduces the stress of, oh my gosh, somebody from administration going to control my schedule. No, I don't, and I don't want to, but we all want to improve the patient experience with access.
Scott and Kara and the team improved access in primary care and then took the program to specialty care. In this next section, Scott refers to CG CAPS, which is a survey of patient satisfaction with their physicians, and it stands for Clinician and Group Consumer Assessment of the Healthcare Providers and Systems. Yes, it's a government survey. And here's Scott talking about the outcomes of his advanced access initiatives.
Better than, imaginable results with primary care and then specialty care are CG CAP scores on patient satisfaction with access went from the 10th and 20th percentile up to the 75th percentile.
When Scott said yes to Texas, he saw that they had a real need for some advanced access also.
Tyler, Texas, in the community where I live today, had a similar story with access. We were at the 30th percentile, bottom 30th percentile in the nation with patient satisfaction to access. So we needed to create a system that would help get patients in quicker. And so we did that here, and it worked very well again, and access improved. Our CG CAPS actually went up to the 90th percentile, and we won a few national awards that year as a result of that, and our health system grew.
Awards? What's that about? Well, in 2018, CHRISTUS Trinity Clinic was the sole national recipient of the American Medical Group Association's Acclaim Award, which celebrates healthcare organizations that are meeting criteria laid out by the Institute of Medicine. There's a case study on the AMGA website, which I'll attach in the show notes. It's written by Dr. Scott Smith. Now, back to Dr. Smith and the outcomes he was talking about.
It was more profitable for the system and really set the roadmap on, hey, how can we do this CHRISTUS-wide, which is what we're doing today. And so that's fun work. Doctors no longer start a visit saying, I have to apologize why it took so long for you to get in. They can get in. The nurses and people on the phone work in a happier environment because we aren't saying, oh, can we double book? Can we squeeze? Can we do that? That's a failure. Those are really fun and they're really impactful. And there's nothing else we could do that will make a greater difference than improving the patient's confidence in being able to access the healthcare system.
It's easy to hear Scott Smith's energy and his values around patients. But as I was editing this podcast, it occurred to me that it was probably hard to envision how he worked. What actions was he taking that made him effective? So I thought, heck, I'll ask someone else. So I asked Dr. Kara Beatty, who Scott had mentioned. Currently, she's the president and CMO of the SCL Medical Group in Denver. I asked her, what actions did Scott Smith take that led to him being an effective leader when she worked with him? She left me a message. Here she is.
Scott really is a master at building systems and processes in a way that best serves patients and the teams who care for patients, and he's just incredibly effective in doing so. What really sets him apart, though, is the deeply respectful way that he treats people and his generosity in directing any celebration or accolades to those around him. Because that's how he shows up, he brings out the very best in people.
Now we're talking. Dr. Beatty points to his expertise with creating systems that work, and then she points to specific behaviors. Number 1, he treats people respectfully, and number 2, he recognizes people. He reflexly gives credit to other people. We heard this when he gave a shout out to Dr. Beatty. What you won't hear, because I edited them out, are the several times during my interview with Scott when he was trying to give credit to me, or he'd say, I think I learned this from you and your colleague, Lynn Elliott. In my search for specific behaviors, I asked Dr. Jack Cochran how he sized up the leadership actions that characterized Scott Smith. Jack was the executive medical director who Scott and I reported to in Colorado. After that role, Jack went on to become the executive director nationally of the Permanente Federation. Dr. Cochran points to the electronic medical record implementation that I mentioned in the introduction. Thousands of staff and over 500 doctors learned the new technology in an unprecedented 5 weeks under the leadership of Scott Smith. Here's Jack Cochran.
I've had the privilege to work with Dr. Scott Smith in the past. I found him to be extremely effective as a leader, especially in dealing with very difficult issues. I'll use an example. A major region-wide implementation of an electronic health record, which is one of the biggest change challenges in healthcare. And why was Scott successful? Well, first of all, his integrity and his values bring a tremendous amount of trust to people. And then his capability and preparation build another type of trust. And this trust is the basis for leading change, being very authentic, being very prepared, and then being very understanding and supportive of people through the process.
Dr. Cochran points to how critical being trusted is for a leader to be effective. And then he points to two sources of that trust. The first, integrity. And we'll circle back to a definition of integrity at the end of this podcast, compliments of another guest weighing in on this topic. And then Jack mentions that the second source of trust, and this is very pragmatic, is a leader's capability and preparation for the job at hand. In this next segment, Scott Smith and I launch into a discussion of the challenges of leading large-scale change, especially when it's likely that people won't want to change. Scott, you've mentioned how privileged you feel to lead physicians, but leading professionals is also very hard. Have you developed any kind of philosophy about dealing with resistance?
Resistance? What is that? Yes.
Scott and I talked a bit about the influence that a consultant, Don Harrison, had on the language that we and a lot of people use when talking about big cultural change. Don Harrison's company is called Implementation Management Associates, or IMA. And I don't know if it's his change model or his idiosyncratic personality, but the lingo, or maybe I should say the lexicon that Don Harrison uses really seems to stick with people. And his change model is really quite useful. Here's Scott talking more about resistance.
Resistance is not always logical. Many times it is emotional. The degree of resistance is related to the degree of change for the individual. And so if we understand that at the get-go, we can talk about it, not let it be an elephant in the room, because it's not a mandate like the military. The general issues an order and everybody has to do it. That is not true in any physician organization I know in the country. You have to sit down and share the information, negotiate, and then, be willing to be wrong. Be willing to correct your course if there's new information presented. And, there are so many, leaders I see get up in a room and they're presenting something. Here's our path. Somebody will, from the crowd, usually a physician, will introduce something not thought of that it's a really big problem with the plan. But yet the person's like, we're going to go with the plan anyway. And they're like, no, you need to say, wow, that's something we did not consider. Maybe we need to take a pause. And that just takes so much courage as a leader to say that. But in my experience, when I do, people come up to me and say, thank God you listened. I can't believe you actually heard me and you're going to put this on pause until you work this out. Being willing to be wrong and being willing to just listen to what you've not considered is really, I think, something that I learned early on that you have to do to gain that street credibility. And then to say, if this is a bad idea, this is how we go back. And I'm happy to share we've never had to go back. That the what ifs and fears, just like any worry, usually don't happen. But for a concerned physician, and this is, their daily life and what change you're proposing, how it affects them, you have to, be willing to say, okay, this is really bad. We will step back. And
I wonder too, Scott, if the fact that that you're going to make this offer, these parameters aren't met, we will go back. I wonder if that drives you to prep in a different way. Also, often leaders who don't really understand the outcomes, don't really understand what this might look like if they're putting things in place that, that might need to be walked back, but they don't anticipate that.
I wonder if people who are maybe listening right now and they're involved in a project, can they go to a document that the executive team has, that the change management team has, and the subjects, the people who are doing the change have, that they all know what the definition of success is. Success is defined before you begin the project. You know what the definition of success is. All of the project sponsors have signed off on it. and you know what measures you're going to look at to determine if it's successful. It's really like an architect, does the drawing before starting construction on the house.
Yes, and it seems like one area where leaders frequently don't plan well is when it comes to figuring out how to resource a project.
So many times people think, well, this can be done without any expense. And that's just not true, even if it's redirection of resources. And boy, doing that planning up front can sure save a lot of heartache later.
It's hard to overstate how important this concept is that Scott just mentioned, being willing to be wrong. Whether it's in the middle of a courageous conversation when you discover you just don't have the facts, or, and this is a hard-earned skill, being able to correct your course in front of a crowd. I just listened to Sam Harris's Making Sense podcast where he interviewed Yuval Noah Harari, the author of Sapiens and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Harari addresses this very issue of how difficult it is for us to admit when we're wrong. Here's the clip.
Very common desire to people all over the world from all walks of life is to be right. That it's very important for people to be correct in their fundamental beliefs in life. It's very, very difficult to admit that you're wrong. People will do terrible things to others and to themselves just not to admit that I've made a mistake, I'm wrong.
The neuroscience of how we attach our identity to being right and the difficulty that poses when we're wrong is the stuff of another podcast altogether. But here we'll head back to the conversation with Scott. So shifting focus to the all-consuming topic of the COVID-19 crisis, I know you're in charge of the command center. Can you think back about how COVID snuck up on you?
I do remember when COVID-19 first started coming to the state. The university official in Texas had canceled all travel for all of the university faculty, and it was like the first in Texas to do that. And we had no cases in the state. And I remember thinking, probably a bit overkill. And then it just started coming our way. And, being on the front line and being a leader in a large delivery system, just so much about this virus, even today, the end of May, that is unknown about it, that it pulled us together. And I imagine people in my position across the country, if not the world, spent much of March and April with almost all of their time dedicated to how we're responding to the COVID virus and taking care of patients, educating our staff and providers, and keeping them safe.
Can you give us a peek into the command center and how you got it set up?
At the front of this very big table in this conference room, we were all too close at the time. That was before we started wearing masks to work even. And I just picked, the most talented people we had in informatics, nursing, operations, quality, finance. We all huddled together on what problems needed to be solved, who needed to be communicated with, and then we broke. And then they spent the next 8 hours of the day making it so. And then we'd get back the next morning. How did that work? And what new information do we need to tackle today? And then they did. And
how effective was your team?
Oh, fantastic. We had many positive comments from other leaders across the organization. And even the team itself would come back saying, we're amazed that we're able to accomplish this as quickly as we have. We needed to have templates in our computer and our EMR ready to host video visits. And our informatics team, I don't know how many hours they worked, but they built that. And they did it in just a matter of a few days. Quality team, the nursing team, the informatics team are all accomplishing this ginormous amount of work in a very short period of time, marketing, communications. And then we come back and we're like, wow.
I'll add a note here. That wow from Scott is his enthusiasm for a high-performing team. I think the COVID disaster has revealed the value and the values of so many healthcare workers. And for doctors, it's highlighted their leadership and their credibility, that technical expertise and tacit knowledge that I talk about in the second podcast. is so visible during this crisis, and the public is paying attention, but so are physicians. I think it's becoming more clear to physicians why they must lead. Scott said about 40% of the people on his command center team are physicians, and he also points to the strong work by his administrative colleagues.
Our administrative partners, were fantastic, worked super long hours. They're at our sides developing the spreadsheets, the communication, the digital media, everything. And when it came to the clinical decision making and, what are our hours of operation? Do we open up another site for testing? They said, hey, you're the clinicians. What do you think is best?
You've got such strong relationships with people, Scott, at all levels. And it seems like we should point to the importance of that purposeful relationship building, because we both know plenty of toxic cultures and cultures where the relationship between administrators and physicians is lousy. I was actually recently on a panel discussing physician unions. The thought was that physicians need protection and need a voice. And I was the only one on that panel saying no to the idea. And only about 5% of physicians are in unions, and most of those are residents. But I wonder if you've been exposed to this idea before of physicians joining unions.
I have had experience working with some labor unions, and certainly understand to some degree how they were developed and why they were developed many, many years ago. And I think they were developed for many, many valid reasons. As a physician, has the opportunity to really work anywhere in the country, in the world, with our degree of education and skill set. And so I think physicians don't have a life that can be, in my mind, in my opinion, that can be managed by any type of labor contract. That's not the type of work we do.
Yes, totally. And physicians need to be leading and managing, not seeking protection from those who are leading and managing. Well, Scott, I would love to get into a conversation about clarity and its bookend, holding people accountable.
Oh, my goodness. I think you and Lynn teach a course on it. It's just how essential it is to have clarity. If you are vague with your direct reports on what you want them to do or how to do it, then, you're going to get what's coming to you. You may get the dream house you wanted, or you may get something that's completely different. It is so important and helps projects be so successful to have the clarity and have the responsibility of what by when, and find leaders who can meet those timelines. And you absolutely hold them accountable to those deadlines.
Yes. So people who can hold other people accountable, which, it always surprises me. It's as if holding somebody accountable, that phrase is an abstraction. And can you shed any more light on holding somebody accountable, what that might look like?
Yes. There's a slide in a change management presentation that I've given on why leaders don't hold other people accountable. It's emotionally uncomfortable. It's a fear of embarrassment. That leader won't have their materials ready. It's a fear of being disliked, fear of being wrong. And so what I do is say, hey, Patty, here's a job, and here's what I'd like you to do. Next Monday at 10 a.m., we're going to have a phone call, and I'm going to ask you for this result. And so when Monday 10 a.m. comes around, I say, hey, Patty, let's review that report. It's not emotionally uncomfortable for me. Sometimes because it can be uncomfortable, that's something that many leaders might not do, and it's maybe holding them back from being the exceptional leader they could be. So that's one technique I use to hold people accountable. And, it does work. I don't think people dislike me because of it. I have a very nice working relationship with my peers, direct reports. And that's something I've learned to do with not just my direct reports, but my colleagues, superiors, managing up.
What failings of leadership drive you a little bit crazy?
What is, I think, universally known as one of the most common criticisms of leaders is that they don't handle the low performer on the team. And everybody knows John does not do his work, come prepared, hold his team accountable, and the leader sits around the table with everyone else and just completely ignores John's performance. Why is John not being held accountable for his department?
It's sort of a betrayal in a way of the high performers, I think.
Right. Right.
Dr. Smith had to head out the door to attend a ribbon-cutting ceremony, presumably replete with face masks and hand sanitizer, so we wrapped up our conversation. Get back to you, and thanks a ton. This was really fun, really cool.
Thank you, Patty. I only feel like we got to like a third of your questions, which were fantastic.
Scott might not have really minded missing out on the 10 rapid-fire wrap-up questions that I had warned him about, but maybe next time. For right now, though, I want to give a big thank you to Scott Smith's colleagues for all of their comments. They helped me zero in on actual behaviors. I do have an obsession with behavior as opposed to vague leadership concepts or, heaven forbid, lists of competencies. This obsession is rooted in research and will be revisited, especially down the road when I talk about how to recruit and select physicians and executives. Meanwhile, here's another comment by Dr. Jim Hardy, an internal medicine physician with KP and the former chairman of the board. He had this to say about Dr. Scott Smith.
You can count on him doing what he says he's going to do, and you can count on him doing the right thing. So of all of Scott's effective leadership traits, the bedrock of all of them is his integrity.
In this clip, I hear Dr. Hardy defining integrity, which Dr. Cochran mentioned earlier, in a specific way, doing the right thing and doing what you say you're going to do. I hope this leader profile has given you ideas about actions that help leaders guide their teams to outstanding performance. In the introduction, I mentioned the 3-part model that describes the work of leaders. Number 1, leaders communicate the territory. Number 2, leaders create outstanding teams and facilitate the work of those teams. And number 3, leaders produce results primarily through others, and they hold their teams accountable. I look forward to talking with more outstanding leaders. Please give me a holler with any feedback or questions, and let me know who you think I should interview. Thanks so much for listening, and above all, and as always, thank you for all of your care and caring. To learn more about how we work with physicians and other leaders to create healthy work cultures, or to join in the conversation for future podcasts, go to license2leadpodcast.com, where you can send me an email or leave me a voice message.